Thank you so much, Professor Brian, Professor Noel, and Professor Liu, and everyone for coming. This is the first time I've ever been to a football stadium. I'm wondering if a bunch of yellow jackets are going to come swarming in if I say something wrong. Originally, I thought if the computer worked well, we would put up an image of Liu Xiaobo and Mo Yan so that you could see them, but you can Google them yourselves. They're famous people. You get all kinds of photographs of them if you like, so you just need to imagine them for now. Liu Xiaobo won the Peace Prize, as Han just said, the Nobel Peace Prize in 2010, and is now serving an 11-year prison term. He was born in 1955, December 28th, the same year, but not the same day, that our other prize winner, Mo Yan, was born, 1955, but on February 17th, and won the prize for literature last year, in 2012. They're both sheep, in other words, Shu Yang, 1955. Nobel Prizes for a long time around the world, of course, but in China too, have been noticed and coveted. And whose turn is it next? This kind of thinking in Chinese literary circles has been going on for a long time. There's something like Olympic gold medals. That is, you want them so that the world recognizes your country, your culture. And it becomes especially important for a country like China, who in today's world, as we all know, is rising, but for the last few centuries has not been risen. And there's a sense that, it's high time the world recognizes us. So gold medals and Nobel Prizes become important. China has its own literary prizes, the Malden Prize, which Mo Yan also won in 2010. But no one notices that outside of China, and even inside, not much. And Mo Yan himself, I'm sure, would not dream of trading his Nobel Prize for the Nobel Prize. So there's something odd here about handing over one's national evaluation of one's cultural output to a committee of Swedes or other foreigners, but it becomes a very important thing. And for China in particular, it's been a frustrating long story. If you go on the web, you can see that there have been 8 Chinese Nobel Prize winners in the natural sciences, physics and chemistry. But 6 of them were citizens of foreign countries, the US, the UK, or France, when they got the prize. The other 2 were citizens of the Republic of China, or Taiwan. There was 1 Nobel Peace Prize winner in the past, but that is the Dalai Lama, won in 1989, and has lived in exile ever since 1959. China's rulers call the Dalai Lama a spinus, a wolf in sheep's clothing, and so on, but they can't conveniently say that he's not Chinese, because that would leave the door open to the claim that Tibet is not China, so that's embarrassing. What about the Literature Prize? Here again, there have been a few close calls. The American writer Pearl Buck, who was born in China and wrote about China and was half Chinese in a lot of ways, won the prize in 1938 for her novel The Good Earth and Other Things. But that doesn't hit the nail on the head, does it? Lao Shaw, the wonderful May 4th era writer, was, and I don't have direct evidence for this, but the circumstantial evidence is pretty good. On a short list in 1968, the Swedes called Beijing to say, we'd like to give it to him. Can you confirm that he's alive? Because you have to be alive. Well, the Swedish embassy couldn't confirm it, and indeed, Lao Shaw had committed suicide 2 years earlier. The next close call was Shen Zongwan, and here the evidence is even better, that he was on the short list in 1988, but alas, died in 1988, and therefore was disqualified. Finally, Gao Xingjian in the year 2000 won the Nobel Literature Prize. But in 1997, Gao had left China, had denounced the Communist Party in China, so did not make at least the rulers in China very happy. The official media in China said, when Gao Xinjian won the prize, that the Nobel Committee had lost authority, and that the Nobel Selection Committee is, and I quote here, a small clique of so-called literary experts who harbor extremely unhelpful attitudes towards the Chinese people. So, finally, after all of these close calls, in the last 3 years, we get these two unequivocal Chinese citizens living in China, Nobel Prize winners, Liu Xiaobo and Mo Yan. Liu Xiaobo was chosen after a couple of decades of considering Chinese human rights activists for the prize. I know this because I went to the ceremony in Oslo, and at the dinner I was seated next to one of the selection committee people. There were only 5 on the committee, and I asked her that question, and she said, yes, we considered a lot of Chinese for a couple of decades, and this just seemed to be the right time and the right person. Ironically, I think one of the main reasons why Liu Xiaobo turned out to be the right person that year, of course, Václav Havel had supported him, Desmond Tutu had supported him, he had a lot of former Nobel Prize winners supporting the case. But the reason they too were supporting him was because of the 11-year prison sentence that he'd been given, which in turn was primarily given, as far as we can figure it out, because of his advocacy of Charter 08, the manifesto that appeared at the end of 2008 calling for reform in China. Education, judiciary, taxes, environmental policy, ethnic policy, military-civilian relations, all kinds of motherhood and apple pie kinds of things that it's hard for anybody to disagree with, but crucially calling for an end to one-party rule. This stuck in the craw of the party and led to an 11-year sentence, which I'm pretty sure is what crucially led to his getting the prize. The giving of the prize then angered the authorities in Beijing, who even 2 days before the prize was announced got wind of it and sent representatives to Oslo and said, don't you dare do this, but they did it anyway. And then when it was announced, there were celebrations in several cities of Liu Xiaobo's friends at restaurants, toasting one another, that were broken up by police, and the participants sent home. Liu Xiaobo's wife was put under house arrest and remains there to this day. Then the leaders in Beijing started to put pressure on diplomats in Oslo not to attend the ceremony, and about a third of the diplomats didn't. Following which there was a boycott of Norwegian salmon and so on and so forth. And even to this day, this little country of Norway is taking the brunt of having made that decision. Now, we get in 2012 the awarding of the prize to Mo Yan in literature. I can't prove this, but I feel that in part that was done in order to mollify the authorities in Beijing. I say that in part because at the speech that Thorbjørn Jagland gave at the Peace Prize ceremony in 2010, which I was listening to, and these words struck me very clearly, he was obviously trying to say this giving of the prize to Liu Xiaobo is not meant as a slap in the face to the Chinese people or the rising Chinese nation. And he said this, among other things. We can, to a certain degree, say that China, with its 1.3 billion people, is carrying mankind's fate on its shoulders. China must be prepared for criticism and regard it as positive, as an opportunity for improvement. And to drive that point home, he mentioned Martin Luther King in our country and said, many Americans were opposed to our awarding of the Nobel Peace Prize to Martin Luther King in 1964. Looking back, we can see that the USA grew stronger when the African-American people obtained their rights. So he was trying to couch it as, we mean the best for you, but we think that this symbol of Chinese human rights ought to be honored. Now, when the Moyen Prize was announced, there had been some precursor rumors too that it would be a Chinese writer. It might be the Japanese writer Haruki Murakami, and then it turned out to be Moyen. When I heard the news, I sent an email to Goran Malmqvist, who's a Swedish sinologist who's on the committee, and you'd think would be the key person to make these kinds of calls. And I couldn't imagine that Malmqvist would be approving of the Moyen decision, because in my view, there were a number of other writers, not to say around the world, but just Chinese writers who, in the quality of their literary art, ought to outweigh Moyen. And I was thinking, why did Goran go along with this? And he wrote back quite openly that he does think Moyen is a good writer, and he was for this, and he was waving the flag, he's on his way to Shandong, and so on. But in any case, when the news came to Beijing, the reaction there was diametrically opposite to what it had been for Liu Xiaobo. Li Changchun, who at the time was a Politburo member, wrote a letter to the state-sponsored Chinese Writers Association saying this: not only this prize for Moyen is not only an embodiment of the flourishing progress of Chinese literature, but also an embodiment of the continuing rise in the overall strength of our state and its international influence. So he tried to appropriate the prize for support of the Chinese state. And others in the Chinese media said that it was high time that a mainstream, quote-unquote, Chinese writer got the prize, which was casting a shadow on Gao Xingjian and earlier, for which the Chinese people have waited too long. Now, it's worth noting that the Nobel Committee that just 2 years before had been a small clique of so-called literary experts who harbor extremely unhelpful attitudes, had suddenly turned out to have very good judgment. Local officials in Shandong, where Moyen is from, began to spend up to $110 million to transform Moyen's home into a village that they called the Moyen Cultural Experience Zone, which I read not only as glorifying the prize and bringing it to our hometown for the glory, but also a commercial opportunity, because now tourists would flock there and do and have. So all of this was music to Moyen's ears, but meanwhile on the web, that unruly medium that nobody can control in China anymore, even though a lot of effort is put into trying to control it, there was some pretty harsh criticism of Moyen and of the decision to give him the prize, primarily on three grounds. One was that in 2009, when Moyen traveled to the Frankfurt Book Fair, he was a vice president, still is, a vice president of the Chinese Writers Association, state-sponsored Writers Association. He gave a prize at the Frankfurt Fair, that he approved, vetted by the authorities, and so it was more or less their mouthpiece. But then when a couple of dissident types, Dai Qing and Beijing in particular, tried to come in, Moyen walked out with the official delegation, and later apologetically told the press that I had to, which no doubt is true. But the point on the web was, you knuckled under. You didn't stand up for your principles. The other incidents were, one was, yes, when Liu Xiaobo was given the prize, and then sentenced to that harsh prison sentence, one of his friends, a film scholar in Beijing named Cui Weiping, did a telephone survey of prominent intellectuals in Beijing, inviting them to comment on the 11-year prison sentence. And she got quite a few pretty bold statements from people who were still living in China and knew that they were risking something in order to say it, about how it's unreasonable, it's too heavy, and they're surprised that it's that harsh, and so on. She called up Moyen, and Moyen said, I'm not clear on the details and would rather not comment. I have guests at home right now, and I'm busy. And so you're being asked, is that your comment? Can I publish that comment? And he said, yes, you can publish that comment. And she did. And, well, that's on the web. That part accounted for him. Most important, though, of the complaints on the web was in June of 2012, the Writers Association in China sponsored an event to copy Mao Zedong's 1942 talks at Yan'an and have prominent writers from all over the country take a paragraph or two and copy the whole thing on the anniversary of this document. Well, for those of you who know Chinese literary history know that that document was the main basis on which Chinese writers after 1949 were censored and thrown in prison. And when I studied in China in the 1980s, there was complaint all over the literary scene about these talks at Yan'an that have been on our necks, and finally we're getting it off. Now we've come to a point where the party wants to celebrate those talks, and a lot of writers agree. Now some didn't. This is significant. Wang Anyi, the famous writer, said, no thanks, I'm not going to copy. Mo Yan did, not only did, but defended it by saying that the Mao talks in their time had, quote, historical necessity and had played a positive role. A few weeks later, the 2009 Literature Prize winner, a Romanian-German woman named Herta Miller, got an email saying that Mo Yan's prize was a catastrophe for him. So he had strong praise from one side, harsh criticism from another. Now what I want to do next is take a look at these two writers in their groups briefly. I want to look at their histories up to the year 1989, because that year was a turning point for both of them. Liu Xiaobo was born in 1955, as I said, in Changchun in northeast China, and was 11 years old when Mao Zedong closed the schools in China, including his school, and he was footloose. And in retrospect, he said that that was a good thing for him, because it allowed him freedom from the handcuffed kind of education that he would have got otherwise, and taught him the most important lesson in life, and that is to think for himself. And he's a bookworm. I mean, it's amazing how broadly, until I worked on his book, he just reads everything. And started to read then. When you could go back to school, he went to Jilin University in 1978 to the Chinese department, and 4 years later to Riverside in Beijing Normal University to do a PhD. Finished in 1988, wrote a dissertation on aesthetics and human freedom, and made a big splash. In fact, a big enough splash that Riverside invited him to stay as a lecturer, Liu Xiaobo, which only the very best, you probably know, students get to do. But during the 1980s, even when he was a graduate student, he developed a reputation for being a plain-speaking provocateur, almost, I'll say. He's known as the Heima, the black horse on the one hand. I first heard of him when I read a report in the Hong Kong press of a fight he got into with Wang Mang, the famous senior writer. No respect for Wang Mang, never mind his seniority. In 1986, Liu Xiaobo wrote, I can sum up what's wrong with Chinese writers in one sentence. They can't write creatively themselves. They simply don't have the ability because their very lives don't belong to them. Give you a flavor of how blunt he is. Blunt intellectually, I mean in person, even then, he was one of the kind of people who would go up and tell you, you're full of baloney, and then still look at you and talk with you. He loved, still does, I'm sure, intellectual combat, but he didn't make it abrasive personally. In the 1980s, he used the West and Western ideals of literary freedom and democracy and so on as his yardstick for measuring how well China is doing. But in this regard, he had a big turning point in 1988-89. This was before the Tiananmen events. He traveled to Europe and into the US and got disillusioned with the West. He went to the University of Oslo for a conference on modern Chinese film that he said was agonizingly boring. He was disappointed with the European sinologists because they could barely speak Chinese, read and translated. And they were way too willing to take at face value the official statements that came out of Beijing. He summed them up by saying they're 98% useless, and yet they were his hosts. This is another example of how he would be blunt, but not personally confrontational. And it comes out in his philosophy that the book title he captured, No Enemies, No Hatred. From Oslo, he went to New York, to Columbia University. Was a visiting scholar there. Went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art and apparently was smitten by these soul-penetrating pieces of Western art that he found. And it dawned on him that Western materialism and contemporary Western political and social forms that he'd so admired before, that were his yardstick for measuring China, weren't the answer either. The West had not solved big problems like the energy crisis, environmental imbalance, nuclear disarmament, the addiction, I'm quoting directly here, the addiction to pleasure and to commercialization, and didn't solve, and he had a transcendental sort of turn here, didn't solve the question of the incompleteness of the individual person. So he decided, I must continue, yes, to hold up other standards, Western standards, to measure China by. That's okay. But I mustn't assume that the West is the answer. It's got all kinds of internal problems. And that is the real problem that's going to put me back to square one in my search. Now, I want to leave Liu Xiaobo right before the Tiananmen events and go to Mo Yan. Mo Yan was born in 1955 to a poor farming family in Gaomi County in Shandong. He said later that his father was stern and sometimes left him intimidated and depressed. Which I don't know Mo Yan well enough to judge here, but I have the sense that his timidity before harsh authority might partly be rooted in his experience with his father. He did 5 years of schooling until the schools closed in 1966. And then he went to a farm to watch cattle. 1974, at age 19, he went to a cottonseed oil plant. Then he needed a backdoor connection to get into. And all through these years, he tells us, enjoyed hearing and telling stories. And he really is a storyteller. You can tell that. An immense number and volume of stories. He says in his early years he read the socialist realist novel, the 1950s socialist realist classics, those novels. And I think that shows in his writing, in the texture of his language. In my analysis, he's much more influenced by Shandong storytelling and by the red classics of the 50s, and by pre-modern Chinese novels like Liao Zhai Zhi Yi and Shui Guan. You know, a lot of his blood and thunder and sex reminds me of Shui Guan, and his so-called hallucinatory realism that the Nobel Committee named reminds me of Liao Zhai stories. I find that kind of root in his aesthetics much more credible than his casual comments to being influenced by William Faulkner or Gabriel Marquez, whom I don't think he's read very much, and I think he almost said that in his Nobel Award speech. Anyway, in 1976, he joined the Army, which, to look at it from his point of view, it was a smart move at the time in Chinese little counties and towns where he grew up. You were boxed in, and one way to get out into the big world was to join the PLA. So I don't blame him for that. I don't think we should. He got out of the Army, remained in the Army until 1997, after which he had become essentially a professional writer and was living on his royalties and so on. He started writing stories in 1981 using the pen name Mo Yan. 他本来姓管, his surname is Guan Mo Ye, but he uses Mo Yan as a pen name. It rhymes with Mo Ye, of course, but the story is that he took this name on the advice of his parents, who told him in the 50s and 60s when he was growing up that it was best to shut up when you were in public, so more. He was best known in the 80s for his series of stories collected together called Red Sorghum, made into a famous movie by Chancellorial Chair in 1986, a saga of sex, wine, cruelty, and resisting Japanese invasion in the 1930s. Now, I'm going to read you a passage that Liu Xiaobo, his friend and literary scholar, wrote about Red Sorghum. Liu wrote this in 2004, but it's remembering the 1980s. Of Red Sorghum, Liu Xiaobo wrote, "It drew freely upon the themes of raw sexuality and adultery. Its theme song, Sister, Be Gutsy, Go Forward, was an unbridled endorsement of the primitive vitality of lust. Against the backdrop of fire-red sorghum in desolate northwestern China, under the broad blue sky and in full view of the bright sun, bandits violently abduct village women. Wild adultery happens in the sorghum fields. Bandits murder one another in competition for women. Male laborers magically produce the widely renowned liquor 6 Mile Red by urinating into the heroine's brewing wine," and so on. All of this not only, this is Liu Xiaobo continuing, all of this not only sets the scene for marvelous consummations of male and female sexual desire, it creates a broad dream vision that carries magical vitality. That Red Sorghum could win prizes symbolizes a change in national attitudes towards sex. Erotic display had come to be seen as exuberant vitality. So they were on the same page back then, these two. They knew each other, not well, but Liu Xiaobo really admired what he'd done. Mo Yan has pointed out correctly that he took heat for Red Sorghum from the authorities, primarily for two things. One is it defied sexual taboos, of course, writing all this explicit sex. And secondly, probably more important, it showed that the peasant resistance of the Japanese, which is one of the hallmarks in the ideology of the Communist Revolution, peasant rebellion under the leadership of the party, was much uglier and shabbier and less well organized than the mythical version had. Anyway, that brings them both to 1989, and I said a moment ago that it was a turning point for both of them. Liu Xiaobo said in his final statement of his trial in 2009 that June 1989 has been a major turning point in my life, and it was. Let's go back to New York, where he was, looking at the Metropolitan Museum of Art and so on. And this was now when the democracy movement and the students' demonstrations, not only in Beijing, but in virtually all the major Chinese cities, was gearing up in spring '89. In April, in New York, Liu Xiaobo wrote that, "I hope I'm not the type of person who, standing at the doorway to hell, strikes an heroic pose and then starts frowning with indecision." So he jumps on an airplane, goes to Beijing, goes to the square, right to the center of activity, and on June 2nd, 2 days before the big massacre, writes a hunger strike declaration. He and a couple of friends organized a hunger strike. 3 friends. I forget it. Anyway, in this hunger strike declaration, he wrote, "We must begin to build democracy in China in a spirit of tolerance and with conscious cooperation. A democratic society is not built on hatred and enmity. It is built on consultation, debate, and voting that are carried out on the basis of mutual respect, tolerance, and willingness to compromise." Sounds fairly innocuous, but in that context, that was a pretty bold statement. And within 48 hours, he was called upon to act on it. Troops came in from the northwest side of the city, were killing their ways down Chang'an Avenue. And the students, a large bunch of them were still in the square, and so was he. And he decided to go and negotiate, that is, compromise, to get the students safe passage out of the southwest corner of the square. And he did. And it's impossible to say how many lives he may have saved by that, but probably dozens, maybe hundreds, we don't know. After the massacre, he took refuge with a diplomat friend in the foreign diplomatic quarter, and ever since has blamed himself severely for not staying in the streets and trying to help, as many of the ordinary folk did. The first chapter in my book, I guess this book isn't out of the desk, this is the one I'm talking about, account of people who did stay on the streets and try to help others and sometimes lost their lives doing the trying to help. So he blames himself severely for that, and ever since then, on the anniversary of the massacre, he's written a poem, and I'm sure he's doing it as long as he has paper and pen in prison as we speak. I'm going to read you part of just one of these. This one was written in 1999, the 10th anniversary of the massacre. He calls it 站在时间的诅咒中, standing in the execrations of time. To me, standing amid the execrations of time, I'm sorry, execrations isn't the best translation, you know, 诅咒, the scoldings of time. That day seems so strange. 10 years ago this day, dawn, a bloody shirt, sun, a torn calendar, all eyes upon this single page. The world, a single outraged stare. Time tolerates no naivete. The dead rage and howl till the earth's throat grows hoarse. Gripping the prison bars, he wrote this in a labor camp in Dalian. Gripping the prison bars, this moment I must wail in grief, for I fear the next so much I have no tears for it. Remembering them, the innocent dead, I must thrust a dagger calmly into my eyes, must purchase with blindness a clarity of the brain, for that bone-devouring memory is best expressed by refusal. That's stanza one. There's 10 stanzas in the poem altogether, so I'm not going to read them all to you. I want to switch to Moyen now in his change after 1989. Both in politics and in literature, he chose a different path from Liu Xiaobo. Very prolific in his writing. We have to say that right away. I said a moment ago, he's such a irrepressible storyteller and has a very vivid, fructive imagination. He published about 8 novels and dozens of stories since 1989. But decided to stay inside the system, as the phrase goes, teach or nay. And in his defense, most people made that decision, not just him. Making necessarily larger or smaller accommodations to official guidelines, publicly preserving the fiction that we are doing no such thing. He went to Beishida and got a master's degree in 1991. Now that's interesting because Beishida fired Liu Xiaobo. Liu Xiaobo was sent into prison after the massacre. He came out in January of 1991 and was told that, no, your job is gone. And ever since then, he's had to live off manuscripts and money that his wife's brother is a fairly successful businessman. So he's never been poor, but he lost his job and has been officially unemployed ever since. But at the same time, and they didn't plan this, but it happened, Moyen went to the same university and registered as a student and got a master's of arts or fine arts, something like that. But that's not significant. What's significant is his writing. But Moyen now faced a new challenge because he made his name on things like Red Sorghum that we just visited. And in the 80s, one way to make your name as a Chinese writer was to 打破禁区, to crash into forbidden zones. From Liu Binyan to Wang Meng to Moyen, people did that in larger or smaller degrees. And I just said he broke into the revelation of sex and the revelation of the reality of the peasant war. These were Jin Chu, and this made his name, and Red Sorghum became a very famous novel and movie and so on. But now, after 1989, those traditional, if that's the word, forbidden zones, things like you can't write sex, were pretty much all broken into. I mean, sex in particular went wild in the 90s and what got written. And when the web came, even more. And then the forbidden zones that remained really were forbidden. Things like Tibet, Xinjiang, Falun Gong, the private lives of top leaders. You couldn't dapua those Jinchu because it was way too dangerous. So you couldn't use that mechanism for your cutting edge, as it were. So Moyen casts around for another kind of cutting edge, and he finds this sort of Rabelaisian voice, if you mean by that. He writes about the animal nature of human beings, eating, excreting, fighting, screaming, bleeding, sweating, fornicating, and betraying, bullying, conniving. I'm sure he's sincere in his revelations of all those things, and brings them sometimes together with these flights of imagination that the Nobel Committee calls hallucinatory realism. But in doing all of this, observes two compromises. One is not to involve the top leaders and the system that they're in. That is, expose corruption and cruelty and hunger and all kinds of suffering at the bottom and do a good job of it, and do it sincerely. The Garlic Balance, published in 1988 in Helen Goldbach's translation. You've seen that is a good example here of how poor farmers are bullied and bankrupted by predatory officials. And in others of his works too, he trades on sympathy for the downtrodden. He's really got sympathy for the downtrodden. But what's crucial to note in the difference between the way he presents these things and the way Liu Xiaobo does is that Liu consistently denounces the entire authoritarian system, including the people at the top levels. Whereas Moyen leaves the top and the question of the whole system out of it. On the flip side of that, we should observe that Liu Xiaobo, in blaming the whole system, is careful not to blame individual people. He makes this point time and again, I'm not blaming you or anybody, it's this system that all of us are stuck in and that we need to get out of. He wrote this at his trial in 2009. I have no enemies and no hatred. None of the police who have watched, arrested, or interrogated me, none of the prosecutors who have indicted me, and none of the judges who will judge me are my enemies. Now, he took out some heat from his dissident friends for that. What do you mean, no enemies? What do you mean, these SOBs, you're going to let them off the hook and stuff? But so there are different opinions here, but Liu Xiaobo, I think, has been consistent in saying that he's not after others. And this is consistent with his attitude in the 80s, too, when he would go up to Wang Meng and say, Wang Meng, you're a crock of nonsense, but let's go have a drink. It's that odd combination of very stern criticism with an attempt not to make it personal. But a moment ago I said that Moyen had to make two compromises. The second one that he had to make was making fun of the suffering that he describes. And he doesn't always do this, of course. But when it gets to anything that's politically sensitive, he consistently does it. When I studied scar literature in the post-Mao era, I noticed that there were a lot of ways where people that just come out of the Cultural Revolution and were dripping with anxieties and fears and so on, but they wouldn't write it squarely. You'd write a couple of little incidents that suggest what you're really saying. Or you go into foggy poetry that suggests what you're saying. Or you write about a historical context that suggests it, but you don't look at it squarely. Moyen has suffered that problem too, and he avoids looking at things that he needs to avoid squarely and uses what I call a kind of daft hilarity to funnel it askance. Let me give you an example here from his big novel that came out in 1996, Full Breasts and Fat Butts. You might, a guy who's obsessed with female body parts, takes saga of his life from beginning to end, but gets to the Great Famine in the late 50s. And you'll know the Great Famine was caused by crackpot political ideas from the top. Mao Zedong and others said, plant the rice close together because we can, get ahead by doing this, but the peasants knew that if you plant the rice stalks that close together, it's going to not work and you're going to lose your crops. One of the other theories that was sent down came from a Soviet agronomist named Lysenko. He said you can cross-breed things and make miracles happen. You can cross tomatoes with pumpkins in order to get giant tomatoes and so on. And this seems crazy. Well, Moyen, loves this, and this is crazy, so he makes fun of it. And in this Feng novel, he writes this. Somebody comes out and says, cross a rabbit with a sheep? Why not? A volunteer speaks up. Sheep sperm into a rabbit is nothing. I don't care if you want me to inject Director Li Gu's sperm into the sow's womb. And then, Moyen writes, everybody broke up laughing. But no sign of a famine. Somebody needs goat's milk, and somebody else goes out and buys goat's milk. So the craziness of the famine is made fun of, and we laugh it off, but we don't see squarely the real thing. In another panoramic novel called Shengzi Hao, Exhausted by Life and Death, he comes to the Cultural Revolution, where a victim is undergoing public humiliation, suffers wicked taunts for 4 pages, and then the crowd, quote, laughed uproariously as he's made to eat a turnip that represents, quote, a fake donkey dick. Defenders of Moyen, so here again, he's making a joke out of stuff that needs to be looked at more squarely. Now, the Nobel Committee people and other defenders of Moyen say that this is black humor, and we need to read it that way. And I'll go along with that about 50%, but not the others. I think of the people who really did suffer this kind of thing and would want a squarer look at it, and Alexander Solzhenitsyn kind of look at it. They don't get that from Moyen. Moreover, I think this kind of askance mechanism of using jokes to divert the pain is welcomed by the government. It's a safety valve. There's a phrase in Chinese literary politics, 小骂大帮忙, a little scolding is a big help. Liu Xiaobo himself has made this kind of point in a 2004 essay. Liu writes that sarcasm has turned into a kind of spiritual massage that numbs people's consciences and paralyzes their memories. That's a perfect statement of what bothers me about Moyen's daft hilarity. Now this leads to the question of, how much should we blame Moyen for these compromises that he makes? I'm opposed to, you can share your opinions with me, what I call the armchair comfort of the bystander who criticizes from a distance. I remember when my friend Fang Yizhi made the decision to accept George Bush's invitation to go into the U.S. Embassy in refuge for 13 months after the 1989 massacre. And a lot of people in the democracy movement overseas scolded him, saying, you chicken, you hid. You could have been Tan Sitong, you could have offered your head, you could have been a hero, you could have been a martyr, and you went into the embassy. And that irritated me intensely because I don't think it's, for those of us who sit here in comfort, It's not our place to point to somebody who's under fire or in danger of fire and say, you ought to behave X, Y, Z because 我喜欢看戏. I like to see your heroic martyr-like actions. So when I think of it that way, I don't want to blame one for his compromises. It's his life, and I'm not risking anything by criticizing him, so I don't want to. Liu Xiaobo himself comments on this kind of thing in an essay. This was written in 2006, called "To Change a Regime by Changing Society," where he's arguing that the top isn't going to willingly change. No, but if the rest of us become more and more civil to each other and work from the bottom up, we can effect long-term change. But he writes exactly on the point of the difference between somebody who's outside the system harping at the government, as he is, and somebody inside the system trying to do their best in that way. And he writes this: when people like me who engage in high-profile confrontation with the regime hear about people who are staying inside the system, perhaps pursuing matters in more low-key ways, the high-profile people should view the efforts of the low-key people not as errors, but as contributions that are complementary to their own. The decision by one person to pay a heavy price for the ideals he or she has chosen to pursue is insufficient grounds to demand that any other person make a similar sacrifice. So you can see, well, for one thing, you can see Liu Xiaobo was broad-mindedness again. Now, you might ask, when Liu Xiaobo tips his hat to people working inside the system, does he have Moyen in mind, or people like Moyen? I can't speak for him. My gut feeling is no, though. He wouldn't put Moyen in the category of somebody pushing inside, doing his best, because Moyen, in a view of a person like Liu Xiaobo, does go too far with his compromises. When he reads an official statement in Frankfurt Fair and won't see other Chinese writers because of it, and things like that, or copies all the ones in the Yan'an talks. I can't imagine Liu Xiaobo approving of that. Now, Moyen's main defense, and the defense offered by his defenders, is usually that the Nobel Prize is a prize for literature, not politics. Politics should be kept out of the picture. And indeed, I think we need to concede that there are a lot of writers, East and West, ancient and modern. It's not hard to find people who were talented writers, but awful human beings, and maybe politically repulsive in what they stood for. So that distinction, I think, is viable. There are two big problems for me with it in applying it to Moyen, though. One is that Moyen himself willingly plays the political game. I mean, he didn't have to copy multiple talks. Other writers have said no. He could have said no. He doesn't have to use daft hilarity to joke about the great family. He could just skip it. If he doesn't want to write about it at all. So he does, you can't say that he's apolitical. He is political. It's just that where he goes with politics is different from where Liu Xiaobo goes. And the other reason I have trouble, I mentioned this at the beginning, is that even as a pure artist, in my view, I don't think his writing compares to other living Chinese writers, Bai Xianyong, Jia Pinghua, Wang Anyi, Ha Jin. Ha Jin writes in English, used to be in Atlanta, right? Ha Jin crafts stories wonderfully. Jia Pinghua also writes about ordinary life from the ground up. He's very Moyen-esque in some ways, but his language is just much better. Moyen needs a good proofreader, a good editor, I think. He throws out a mixture of ordinary Tuhua kinds of things mixed in with that 1950s socialist realist language and falls into anachronisms. He's got this novel about the boxer movement, the Panxianxin, where he describes a young woman who refers to her 领导者 that kind of thing is pretty common. I mean, Lin Daozhou is a contemporary, post-49 communist term. Nobody like Qing would ever use that. And he doesn't write very carefully. Frankly, I think my friend Howard Goldblatt translates Moyen into a language that's better and smoother and more unified than Moyen's own. So just on those grounds, I find it difficult to put him at the top of the list, not only for the texture of the language, but for what the Nobel Literature Prize claims to be about. In 1895, the will of the famous industrialist Alfred Nobel founded these prizes, of course. And for the Literature Prize, it's supposed to go to, quote, the person who shall have produced in the field of literature the most outstanding work in an ideal direction. And those last four words, people on the web in China jumped all over them saying, where's his idealism? Well, there's a good point. I mean, he writes about blood and guts and scolding and suffering and women's breasts and this and that. But doesn't help me, I don't think helps readers to see something that's more ideal or better. So on those grounds too, I think it's an odd choice. Not completely odd, of course, because he's well known and he's got a lot of readers. And, I think he'd be on the list of any Chinese literature scholars, top 10, probably top 6. Anyway, they're both born in 1955. So they're both Shuyang, they're both sheep. I looked on the web what it says about sheep. Where did I have this here? Yeah, sheep are insecure. They need to feel loved and protected. They're easily drawn into complex predicaments. They usually shy away from confrontation, pull back when faced with heavy-handed authority, and refuse to take an opposing stand. There's my summary. Moyen, he is a sheep. Liu Xiaobo somehow jumped out of the mold and is completely a renegade sheep. But I'll stop here and welcome your questions, your objections, or your comments, whatever you have.
Right.
Professor Lin, I really enjoyed your talk. Do you know by any reason any other Chinese author were on the short list?
Oh, no.
No.
No, I don't know the short list. I don't know. Even for the Peace Prize with Liu Xiaobo, I don't know who this woman sitting next to me meant when she said we've been considering others. So I can't answer that question. For the Peace Prize, I'm pretty sure the others would include Li Jingsheng. After 1989, several times. He was prominently nominated by people around.
I want to follow up on my questions on short list because you said Lao Shoushun is one important thing.
Right.
And so is Beidao ever on the short list? And people always say there are trajectories for people to get the Nobel Award. Your work has to be translated into English.
Right.
You have to go there to be a visiting scholar. That Beidao has done all of that.
Right.
He lost the document. I actually lost him more than that. So your view, and also the translator, foreign language, because he stands to gain a lot, right? After which is the same person we're talking about that he translated most of his works, and it's going to sell very well after the So is there conflict of interest? As you see, I mean, it is widely discussed on the web about, there is a sort of personal thing here.
Right.
And he is influential on the committee, so.
Right. No, he certainly should be influential on the committee. He's the only one on the committee who can read Chinese. And I've seen those criticisms too. I didn't want to mention them because I have mixed feelings about Goran. He's a wonderful old man, he's an old friend, and in general, he's been very good on the question of Chinese human rights. Here, I don't know what happened, but he went for Moyen, and I think it's probably not fair to think that his main motive would be meretricious. I don't think so. But would he be in a mood to compromise with a message from Beijing that might say, come on, how about giving one of our mainland authors a chance here? You just insulted us with Liu Xiaobo. That kind of pressure I shouldn't be speculating in front of the camera about what this is.
Okay.
So that it would be easily translated so that he could be a candidate for the Nobel Prize. Which probably went too far, but there's certainly some truth to that there's a bias towards getting your works known in English